Let us toast the ones we have replaced, he said. Right there in front of the bank, the board, the new hires, and the grand seafood tower, he actually uttered those words. Everyone laughed as if it were charming, as if it were not a ticking time bomb tied to a $150 million transaction. I watched the ice melt in my water glass and smiled like a polite relic. That was what they called me now. The dinosaur, the paper pusher, the compliance shadow. They thought I was too old to innovate and too mild-mannered to strike back. But what they never figured out was that I did not stay quiet because I was weak. I stayed quiet because I was observing and waiting. My name is Lawrence Miller, and I am 55 years old. 6 months ago, I was the contracts and risk manager. Everyone came to first when a deal smelled off. I knew every clause, every subclause, and every signature page that ever caused a chief financial officer to break into hives. My initials were on the original vendor forms from back when our firm could barely make payroll. I had spent 30 years in corporate risk, with 15 of those years dedicated to this exact office. Once, I caught a phrasing error in a licensing agreement that saved us from a 6-figure lawsuit. Back then, they clapped me on the back like I was a magician. Then came Julian Bradley, our new chief executive officer. Julian, with his perfect resort tan and leadership quotes taken from cheap self-help books. He looked at a compliance dashboard as if it were a magic 8-ball. He arrived with the energy of a man who had never read a contract in his life, but possessed a strong gut feeling about how businesses should run. Within a week, he reorganized my entire department into something he called proactive integrity, which is just corporate jargon, for we have no idea what we are doing, but it looks great in a slideshow. Julian replaced 3 of my best risk analysts with a former lacrosse coach, his buddy from business school, and a young man named Brody Sanders who had spent the last year selling reverse mortgages on social media. I am not joking. Brody wore bright sneakers to client meetings and kept saying things like just vibes when asked about missing transaction documentation. Guess who was asked to train Brody? Yours truly. Nothing says we value your 30 years of institutional knowledge like asking you to teach a man who thinks digital signature software is a dating application. At first, I tried to help. I documented our workflows. I flagged potential issues. I emailed polite reminders about Clause 9.4 and Risk Signatory Protocol. I even bought them donuts on Friday mornings. But after Julian spilled espresso on a master agreement, laughed it off, and called it papers for old people, I stopped trying to fix their mistakes. I started archiving. He would glance at my detailed risk summaries for 2 seconds, toss them in the recycling bin, and tell me that the company needed to look forward, not backward. I watched him make deals with vendors based on handshakes and empty promises, ignoring the fact that our liability coverage was completely inadequate. I kept my daily logs of every single transaction. I did not store them in the company system. Mind you, they had locked me out of the main database, claiming it was part of their streamlining effort. But I kept secure backups on my own drive. I logged dates, times, and document versions. I saw the bank term sheet come through with language that made my palms sweat. It was a clause that tied verbal statements made during the funding execution window to operational intent. One wrong word, even spoken in jest, and the entire lending covenant could be flagged. I brought it up once in a meeting. Julian smiled his empty smile and said that nobody read that clause garbage except lawyers who live with their cats. That was the moment I realized I was not training Brody. I was training my replacement. I was not part of the team. I was the cautionary tale of what happens when you get too comfortable. So I decided to get uncomfortable in absolute silence. I printed key documents. I timestamped internal messages. I took screenshots of sloppy edits. When I could not access certain systems, I asked other coordinators to send me files for mentorship review. They did, bless their chaotic hearts. And I built a quiet paper trail so thick it could suffocate a small animal. Then they stopped inviting me to planning meetings. Human Resources called it a professional realignment. My name was quietly dropped from the funding execution schedule. No hard feelings, Lawrence. Julian grinned during my last planning call. We just need people who can move fast. Yet, they still let me come to the celebratory dinner. They probably thought it would be funny to have the living relic at the table while they toasted the next era of their department. I wore my best suit. I brought a polite smile, and I watched. I knew exactly when the execution window started. I knew that if Julian said the wrong thing at the wrong time, I had one email ready to go in my drafts. One little message, one timestamp, one truth. All it needed was the right trigger, and a glass raised just high enough to bury him. I sat there in silence, a quiet observer of my own planned departure, knowing the exact rules they were about to break. I watched the room fill with confidence, completely unaware of the storm that was gathering just outside their view. The critical email came on a Wednesday, sandwiched between a mandatory phishing awareness memo and an all-hands invitation, with a musical notes emoji in the subject line. The memo read like it was written by a caffeine-addled intern who had just discovered corporate buzzwords. Buried 3 paragraphs down was the real change. To optimize cross-functional synergy, contracts and risk sign-off responsibilities would now be shared across the strategic execution pod. That pod consisted of 3 people: Brody Sanders, the former social media salesman; Chloe Jenkins, a rebranded office administrator who once asked if net revenue was the same as leftover money; and Justin Foley, who honestly believed compliance was a department in human resources that ordered safety posters for the break room. My name was nowhere to be found. There was no mention of the man who had written the original sign-off matrix. No mention of the person who used to stay until 9 in the evening comparing red lines from 3 different law firms because our technical team was terrified of indemnity language. They did not even copy me on the implementation emails. I only found out because Chloe accidentally forwarded me a chat export meant for their modernization squad. It included a meme of a skeleton sitting at a desk with the caption, "When Lawrence explains clause structure." It was charming, to say the least. By Friday, I could no longer log into our contract database. My access card still opened the front door. Bless their mercy, but not the secure archives. I received an apologetic message from our support team. It said they were following the new access controls and asked if I needed help onboarding onto their new task tracking system. They had replaced our secure contract lifecycle management software with a free project board tool. I have seen toddlers organize modeling clay with more security. Julian, ever the walking smirk, called it streamlining compliance. He said legacy systems created friction. What he really meant was that proper systems made it harder to fake the numbers. The new team did not know friction from fraud, and frankly, they did not care. Chloe thought a non-disclosure agreement stood for New Deal agreement and once uploaded a confidential contract to a graphic design website to make it look prettier. Brody started sending unsigned drafts directly to major vendors. I stopped sleeping through the night, watching the chaos unfold. Chloe once spent an entire afternoon trying to organize a critical compliance folder alphabetically by the first name of the contract signee, which created a complete mess of our file structure. When I pointed out that contracts are archived by company name and execution date, she rolled her eyes and told me I was ruining her creative flow. Then came the disbursement file from our funding bank. It landed in a shared folder during a pre-funding scramble. I was not supposed to see it, but again, Chloe sent it to the wrong distribution list. I opened it. It was 48 pages long, with 3 detailed appendices, containing the kind of conditional language that would give any real compliance officer night terrors. Clause 9.4 was right there. It stated that any oral or written representations made by executive leadership during the disbursement execution window shall be treated as indicative of operational intent and subject to covenant compliance review. That sentence hit me like a physical blow. I read it 3 times. One joke, one offhand remark, one ego-drenched toast. If it happened during the disbursement window, the bank could freeze the funds pending a full investigation. It was a landmine dressed in legalese, and not one person on the strategic execution pod had read it, let alone understood it. I did not scream. I did not march into Julian's office waving the document. That would have been professional suicide. They had already branded me as overcautious. They called me the risk ghost, who was always worrying about what-ifs. Julian liked to tell the team that you cannot grow if you are scared of falling. I once muttered that you cannot fall if you have already jumped off a cliff with a blindfold on. But nobody laughed. So I smiled. and I started downloading old copies, final versions, signed amendments, and timestamped messages. I organized a private archive that was secure, local, and encrypted. I pulled up everything I could find on the bank's funding covenants and every past email chain about compliance interpretations. I even printed a few physical copies of particularly fragile clauses. Julian would miss paper when his cloud storage went down. I forwarded myself files under the guise of transition training. I told Chloe I was creating a knowledge base for the new team. She thanked me with an emoji of clapping hands. Meanwhile, Brody ordered $800 in branded pens for the deal signing. The more I watched, the more I saw how hollow our operations had become. Policies were written with typos, signatures lacked dates, and approvals were made via thumbs-up emojis in chat rooms. They were not just sloppy, they were dangerous. And they were heading into a $150 million transaction with a major financial institution, as if they were going to a weekend brunch. I could have resigned, I thought about it, but something in me refused to walk away. Not out of spite, but because someone had to remember what integrity looked like. Even if they thought I was irrelevant. They wanted a new era, and I was going to make sure they got exactly what they deserved. I locked my desk drawer and left for the evening, my private archive safe and complete. I brought the issue up over lunch. I kept my tone casual and measured, as if I were just making polite conversation over a reheated meal in the break room, while someone's headphones leaked radio pop music, and the coffee machine wheezed like it needed resuscitation. So, Clause 9.4 in the disbursement agreement, I said to Brody, who was slouched across the table drinking a protein shake that smelled of synthetic vanilla. There is language in there about verbal representations during the execution window. If someone says the wrong thing during that time, the bank could technically interpret it as binding. Brody blinked twice. Then he smiled as if I had just explained the concept of electricity to a sandwich. Lawrence, he said, pausing to flex his jaw, which I believe he thinks adds to his authority. No one reads that clause garbage. It is just legal noise. Banks have to make everything sound scary. If we worried about every line in these documents, we would never get anything done. I felt my left eyelid twitch. Before I could respond, Chloe burst into the room holding a glass of dark wine, even though we were still in the middle of the workday. She waved a printed draft of the funding agreement and set it down right on a damp counter. Then she spilled her drink. The red liquid splashed across the table and soaked through the pages, staining the text. "Oh no," she said in that sing-song voice of people who have never been held accountable for a single adult decision. "Whatever, we have it saved in the shared drive, right?" She laughed, and Brody joined in. I stared at the ruined page containing Clause 9.4. As the ink bled into the paper, it looked like a crime scene. It was fitting, in a way. "Lighten up, Lawrence," Chloe said. "It is not like we are mailing this to the government." She meant it as a joke. That afternoon, I received a calendar invite from Human Resources titled Mentorship Opportunities. Building the next-gen team. I had been in this business long enough to know what that really meant. I was being phased out. Mentorship was just corporate hospice care. They wanted me to train the new hires before they wheeled me out of the building and deactivated my credentials. The meeting was led by Brenda Albright, our Human Resources Director. She wore her usual expression of tight-lipped sympathy, looking like she was trying to sell me a casket. "Lawrence, your experience is so valuable," she said. "We really think you can nurture this new team into a place of confidence and independence." Brenda kept flipping through a presentation slide deck, with bright colors and diagrams showing our department's new structure. It was full of circles and arrows that pointed to nothing of substance. She spoke in a soft, patronizing voice, treating me as if I were a delicate piece of glass that might break at any moment. I bit the inside of my cheek. I smiled. I nodded like a polite ghost. Brenda kept using words like guidance, support, and succession planning. She mentioned a transition timeline. I mentally noted the phrasing. It was vague and non-committal. They did not want me to resign immediately. They wanted me to fade away slowly enough that I would not file a wrongful termination lawsuit. I walked out of that office and back to my desk, where my inbox now featured an urgent message from Brody titled, "Can you sign off on this contract before lunch?" Attached was a shared document with 5 different untracked versions. No metadata, no counterparty initials, and a signature block that simply read approved by the execution pod. My mouse hovered over the reply button for a full 5 seconds. Then, I closed the window. That was the exact moment I decided. No more corrections, no more warnings, and no more saving them from themselves. I created a new folder on my personal drive and named it Frosting. If anyone ever saw the name, they would think it was about cakes or recipes. Inside, I started archiving everything. I saved emails, contract drafts, chat messages, screenshots of unauthorized edits, file timestamps, and modification histories. Every time Brody changed language in a document, I saved both versions. Every time Chloe sent a file to the wrong vendor, I logged it. I began copying the metadata of key agreements. I did not raise a fuss. I did not push back. I just watched and saved. There is a unique power in being the only person who remembers how things are supposed to be done. It is not loud, but it is real. And when the loud people start crashing into each other, that quiet archive becomes lethal. The next week, Julian held all-hands meeting about the upcoming funding dinner. He called it a celebration of evolution. He said we were entering a new chapter defined by boldness and speed. I stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, watching him talk like he was auditioning for a commercial. People cheered. Someone popped a bottle of cheap wine. Chloe cried. Brody wiped his eyes with a napkin as if he were watching a classic movie. I smiled, and when the confetti went off, I pulled out my phone and checked the timestamp. I filed it away in my database. I knew the stage was set and the actors were in place. They were marching toward their own end, laughing all the way. The dinner was held at an expensive restaurant downtown, one of those trendy places where the lights were dim enough to hide the prices, and the food arrived on polished wooden boards. Julian picked it, of course, claiming it was where real corporate deals were finalized. Half the strategic execution pod did not even know how to pronounce the menu items. Chloe asked if the liver spread was vegan. Brody tried to order a cocktail shaken like he was in a movie, much to the bartender's visible annoyance. The plates were slate tiles that made a grating sound every time a fork touched them, and the servers explained each dish as if it were a modern art piece. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary and expensive olive oil. Julie Sand sat at the head of the long table, holding court like a king who had just conquered a new territory. It was supposed to be a pre-closing celebration, a soft launch of our funding victory. The bank disbursement team was preparing the wire transfer, and Julian, armed with pathological optimism, called it the victory lap. They sat me next to the cold brick wall, far from the center of the table. I was close enough to hear the jokes, but not close enough to interrupt them. It was perfect for my purpose. The mood was far too loose. Brody had already removed his expensive blazer and unbuttoned his collar. Chloe was taking pictures of the olives for her online profile. Justin was live posting the moment online, which was interesting since nobody had explained the non-disclosure agreements to him yet. And then Julian said it. He leaned back in his leather chair and raised his wine glass. He grinned at the team and said, "Clear as day, we really bluffed through that due diligence, did we not?" They did not ask about half the items I thought they would. That is a massive win in my book. There was loud, sycophantic laughter around the table. Brody cheered and clapped him on the back. I did not laugh. I excused myself, phone in hand, and walked calmly to the restroom. I pulled up the funding agreement on my screen. I had read it 100 times, but now I searched with surgical precision. There it was on page 22, clause 9.4. Any oral or written representations made by authorized executive leadership during the disbursement execution window shall be treated as indicative of operational intent and subject to compliance review. I scrolled to the definitions section. The execution window had opened the moment the disbursement protocol was initiated earlier that afternoon, and it would remain open until final wire confirmation. This meant Julian's boast about bluffing due diligence was live, and it was a direct violation of the covenant. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1014, making false representations to a financial institution during a credit application process is a federal offense. This specific section of the federal code penalizes anyone who knowingly makes false statements to influence the actions of a bank on a loan. I stared at the screen as the laughter echoed down the hallway. Julian had no idea that every syllable he spoke could cost him the entire deal. I returned to the table, calm and smiling. I poured myself a glass of water. I did not touch a drop of alcohol. I wanted my mind sharp, completely unaffected by the celebration. I tapped a note into my phone. 9:13 in the evening. Julian toast about bluffing due diligence during execution window. I did not need a voice recording. I needed precision, timestamps, and network verification. I had drafted the email 3 days before the celebration. It sat in my drafts folder like a loaded weapon with the safety on, waiting for the right moment. There were no accusations, just a quiet inquiry wrapped in professional courtesy. The recipient was Margaret Thorne, senior risk counsel at the funding bank. I had met her once during a minor vendor dispute. She had complimented my attention to detail and my respect for compliance. The body of the email was simple and precise. Hi, Margaret. I hope all is well. I wanted to flag Clause 9.4 in the disbursement agreement as there may be potential confusion regarding verbal representations made during the active execution window. I have attached my notes and timestamps in case a review is warranted. Please let me know if further clarity is required. Best Lawrence Miller. Attached were 2 files. One was a document highlighting the relevant sections of the agreement. The other was a table listing key events, their timestamps, and the attendees. There was no emotion, just facts. I left the cursor hovering over the send button. The celebration was in full swing when I returned. Julian stepped near the center, tapped his glass with a fork, and raised his voice. This is a big one, he said. A deal this size does not happen without taking a few risks. And yeah, we made some bold calls, but look at us now. He lifted his champagne and said, let us toast the ones we have replaced. I took out my phone, opened my drafts, and tapped send. 1 click, 8:46 in the evening. Right as his glass clinked against Chloe's, the message left my outbox. I looked up and smiled. Julian had just detonated his own career, and I was the only one who had the matches. I walked back to my seat, took a slow sip of water, and watched them celebrate their own downfall. At 7:46 the next morning, my office door creaked open. I was not surprised. I had been at my desk since 6:30, sipping black coffee and reviewing the industry news. Outside, the building buzzed with an uncomfortable silence. Phones were not ringing, and online chat channels had stalled completely. The knock came at 7:51. It was Justin, pale and sweating, his tie slightly crooked. Have you seen the system? He asked, his voice cracking. We are locked out of the Treasury portal. Julian is shouting about firewalls and hacker attacks. I logged in slowly. The portal was indeed locked. Then, right on schedule, came the notification from the bank. It was addressed to our chief financial officer. The subject line read, Urgent Clause 9.4 Disbursement Hold. The bank had frozen the $150 million pending clarification of verbal statements made during the execution window. They requested a written account of all remarks made by authorized leadership between 4 in the afternoon and 10 in the evening. At 8:17, the chief financial officer passed Julian a printed copy of the email. Julian scoffed, claiming they could not freeze funds over a joke. But his voice shook. Get legal on the phone, he snapped. And where is Lawrence? He is the only one who reads this stuff. The emergency meeting was called for 10:15 in the conference room. I walked in at 10:14. Julian was pacing by the window, his shirt untucked, looking like a man who had lost his fortune overnight. Brody sat stiffly in his chair, staring at his laptop, while Chloe was quietly crying into a paper towel. On the screen was the bank's lead counsel, Jonathan Barlow. He was calm and surgical. We have initiated a covenant hold based on a potential representation issue, Jonathan said. It is procedural, but depending on what we uncover, it may become permanent. Julian tried to laugh it off. Let us not turn a party toast into a legal trial, he said. Jonathan Barlow did not blink. He held up a printed copy of my email. This was sent at 8:46 in the evening. During the execution window, he said. It includes Clause 9.4 annotations. It was sent from the event network. Can someone confirm who wrote this? I nodded calmly. That was me, I said. All eyes turned to me in shock. Julian stared as if I had spoken in another language. Jonathan Barlow then displayed a social media video clip. It was Justin's online post showing Julian's toast at 8:46 in the evening. The caption read, Let us toast the ones we have replaced." The room went completely cold. The chief financial officer reached for his water, but his hand shook so hard he spilled it across the table. Jonathan Barlow continued. Under Clause 9.4, and in accordance with federal banking standards regarding material representations, we require a formal statement. Until we determine if this constitutes a covenant breach, the $150 million remains frozen. The screen went black. Julian slumped into his chair, his confidence completely gone. He had no buzzwords left. The board members turned their glares toward him. At 11:21, Human Resources sent me a message asking for a quick chat. I ignored it. Shortly after, the general counsel requested my presence. In the meeting room, the lawyers were frantically trying to draft a response. Julian looked at me, his eyes red with fury and panic. "You knew this would happen," he muttered. "I knew what the contract said, and I knew what the law required," I replied. The board eventually terminated Julian's contract for gross negligence, and the strategic execution pod was disbanded by the end of the week. The bank released the funds only. After our firm agreed to a strict external audit and restructured the risk department, placing me back in charge with a significant promotion and a substantial salary increase. I spent the next 3 days explaining the transition steps to the board of directors. They listened to my report with absolute attention, taking notes on yellow pads. Brenda Albright spent the next week trying to clean up the human resources files, her face pale and her standard polite smile completely gone. Brody Sanders was escorted from the building by security after he was caught trying to download client files onto a personal storage drive. He looked around the lobby as if searching for someone to blame, but nobody would make eye contact with him. Chloe Jenkins resigned the following Monday, sending a brief email that lacked even a basic thank you. Justin Foley was reassigned to the facility maintenance team to oversee safety poster updates. I returned to my office and sat down. I looked at Gerald, my office fern. We had survived another storm. I opened my personal drive and quietly deleted the folder named Frosting. I did not need it anymore. The trap had closed, and the people who thought I was too old to matter had learned that in the world of high-stakes contracts, the quiet ones are the ones who keep the time. This was my victory, written in black ink, absolute compliance, and the sweet sound of silence. I turned on my computer and began my work, ready to rebuild what they had broken. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the company return to where it belonged.